If you've ever dragged a hose across your yard in July, sweating through your shirt just to keep a flower bed alive, this video is going to save you a lot of summers. There's a whole category of perennials that don't just tolerate dry spells. They actually prefer them. Plant them once. Give them a couple of seasons to settle in, and then mostly leave them alone. No daily watering schedule, no babysitting, just flowers that show up every single year, whether you remember to water or not. Today we're counting down 12 of the toughest, most reliable drought-tolerant perennials for US gardens, the ones that keep coming up again and again across extension office guides, nursery recommendations, and real gardener experience. Every plant on this list prefers full sun and well-drained soil, and every single one needs regular water for that first year, while the roots are establishing. That part isn't optional, but once they're settled in, usually after 1 to 3 growing seasons, they can shrug off weeks without rain and keep blooming anyway. Here's the thing that makes this category of plant so valuable beyond just saving you time with a hose. Water restrictions are becoming a bigger part of gardening in huge parts of the country, and a lot of municipalities now limit outdoor watering to certain days or certain hours during the summer. Perennials that can handle those gaps without dying back give you a garden that still looks intentional even when you can't water it every day, which matters a lot more than it used to even a decade ago. We'll cover the USDA hardiness zones for each one, roughly how tall they get, and why they've earned a permanent spot in low-water gardens across the country. A quick note before we start. Hardiness zones tell you the coldest temperatures a plant can survive over winter. So if you're not sure which zone you're in, a quick search of your zip code and USDA hardiness zone will tell you exactly where you fall. Matching a plant to your zone is honestly the single biggest factor in whether it thrives or struggles, more important than soil type or even sun exposure in a lot of cases. Let's get into it. Number 12, Fringed Blue Star. Fringed Blue Star, botanically known as Amsonia, is the plant most people on this list have never heard of, and that's a shame because it's quietly one of the best performers for dry, well-drained sites. It's a native perennial, generally hardy in zones 6 through 9, reaching about 2 to 3 feet tall with a soft, airy texture that works well toward the front or middle of a border. What makes Amsonia special is that it's not a one-season plant. In spring, it produces clusters of pale blue star-shaped flowers, which is where the name comes from. Then, once summer arrives and the flowers fade, the fine willowy foliage just sits there looking clean and tidy through the heat of the season, asking for basically nothing. And then in fall, it does something most spring bloomers never bother with. The foliage turns a genuinely brilliant gold, giving you a second show right as everything else in the garden starts winding down. Because it's slower growing and less flashy than something like a coneflower, Amsonia often gets skipped over at the nursery. But if you want a plant that handles dry soil, needs almost no maintenance, and still earns its space in the border twice a year, this is the one people usually regret not planting sooner. There's also a practical reason landscapers have started using it more in recent years. Amsonia holds its shape well without staking, doesn't flop over in wind or rain the way taller perennials sometimes do, and rarely needs dividing more than once every several years. Once you plant it and give it that first season or two of consistent water, you can genuinely forget about it, and just enjoy the payoff twice a year. Speaking of plants that look almost architectural in a dry garden, our next pick is about as low maintenance as perennials get. Number 11. Globe Thistle. Globe thistle, or echinops, is the plant you grow if you want your garden to look like it belongs in a botanical illustration. It produces perfectly round spiky steel blue flower balls on tall stems, generally reaching 2 to 4 feet, and it's hardy across a wide range of zones, typically doing well from around zone 3 through 9 depending on the variety. Here's the part that surprises new gardeners. Globe thistle actually performs better in leaner, poorer soil than it does in rich garden beds. Give it too much fertility and water, and the stems get floppy and the plant sprawls. Give it dry, average soil and full sun, and it stands upright and tight, exactly the look you want. That makes it one of the rare perennials where neglect isn't just tolerated, it's genuinely part of the care instructions. Bees and butterflies treat globe thistle like a buffet table once it blooms in midsummer. And the dried seed heads look striking well into fall if you leave them standing instead of cutting them back right away. It's deer resistant too, which matters a lot if your dry, sunny garden happens to sit right next to a wooded area where deer wander through looking for an easy meal. One thing worth knowing before you plant it: globe thistle has a long taproot, similar to how a carrot grows, which is a big part of why it handles drought so well. That same taproot means it doesn't love being moved once established, so pick its spot carefully the first time rather than planning to relocate it later. Give it room too, since a mature clump can spread wider than new gardeners often expect. Our next plant brings a completely different shape to the border. Instead of round and spiky, think tall and tubular, and hummingbirds absolutely cannot resist it. Number 10. Beard Tongue. Beard tongue, known botanically as penstemon, is one of the most underrated native perennials for dry gardens in the entire country. With well over 250 species, penstemon ranges from petite, low-growing varieties, barely a foot tall, to towering types that can reach 5 or 6 feet, and different species are suited to hardiness zones anywhere from 3 through 10. So there's almost certainly a penstemon bred for your specific region. The tubular, bell-shaped flowers come in shades of white, pink, purple, and a deep wine red, arranged in tall spikes that give a garden bed vertical structure most drought-tolerant plants lack. And because those tubular blooms are exactly the shape hummingbirds are built to feed from, penstemon tends to pull in more hummingbird traffic than almost anything else on this list. The one thing penstemon actually cares about is drainage. It handles poor sandy or rocky soil beautifully, but soggy, compacted clay will kill it faster than any drought ever could. If your yard drains well and gets plenty of sun, penstemon will reward you with a long bloom season, typically from early summer well into fall, with almost no fussing required once it's established. Because there are so many species, it's worth doing a little homework before you buy. A penstemon variety bred for the humid southeast behaves very differently from one bred for the high desert southwest. And picking the wrong regional type is one of the more common mistakes new gardeners make with this plant. Your local extension office or a native plant nursery can usually point you toward the specific penstemon that actually belongs in your climate. Next up, a plant that looks like it's on fire, in the best possible way, and one that practically defines the phrase heat-loving perennial. Number 9. Blanket flower. Blanket flower, or Gaillardia, gets its common name from the way its daisy-like blooms echo the color pattern of traditional Native American blankets, with rings of fiery red, orange, and gold radiating out from a dark center. It's cold hardy across zones 3 through 9, generally reaching 1 to 2 feet tall, and it starts blooming in late spring, then keeps going non-stop straight through fall if you deadhead it occasionally. Gaillardia is genuinely one of the toughest bloomers you can plant. It thrives in poor sandy soil, laughs off summer heat, that wilts other flowers, and tolerates drought without missing a beat. The trade-off is that it's often a short-lived perennial, sometimes only sticking around for 2 or 3 years, especially in humid climates, or if the soil holds too much moisture over winter. The fix most experienced gardeners use is letting a few flowers go to seed each year. Blanket flower reseeds readily, so even as older plants fade out, new ones tend to fill in right behind them. Pair it with something like sedum or ornamental grasses for a striking dry garden combination, and you'll have color from late spring through the first frost with almost no irrigation required after that first establishment season. Deadheading matters more with blanket flower than with some of the other plants on this list. Snip off spent blooms every week or two during the growing season, and you'll noticeably extend how long it keeps flowering. Skip that step and the plant will still bloom, just with noticeably less enthusiasm as the season wears on. Our next plant smells incredible, draws in pollinators by the dozens, and has a name that sounds a lot stranger than the plant actually looks. Number 8. Agastache. Agastache, sometimes called hummingbird mint or anise hyssop, depending on who you ask, is one of those plants that seems to do everything right at once. It's generally hardy in zones 5 or 6 through 9 depending on the variety, typically growing 2 to 4 feet tall, and the tall spikes of tubular flowers come in shades of purple, pink, orange, and blue. Crush a leaf between your fingers, and you'll usually catch a burst of licorice, or mint scent, which is part of why deer and rabbits tend to leave it alone, but the real draw is the wildlife it does attract. Bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds treat agastache like one of the best food sources in the entire garden, and the bloom season stretches impressively long, often from midsummer all the way into fall. Like most plants on this list, agastache wants full sun and soil that drains well. It genuinely does not like wet feet, especially over winter. So if your yard tends to stay soggy after rain, raised beds or amended soil will make a real difference. Once it's settled in though, agastache handles heat and dry spells about as well as anything you can plant. Gardeners in colder zones sometimes find that agastache behaves more like a short-lived perennial than a permanent fixture, especially if winter drainage isn't ideal. The fix is usually the same one that works for blanket flower. Let a few seed heads mature and drop before you clean up the bed in fall, and new seedlings will typically show up the following spring to keep the planting going. Now we're moving into a plant that stores its own water supply right in its leaves, which is exactly why it barely needs you at all. Number 7. Sedum. Sedum, also called stonecrop, is a succulent perennial, and that single fact explains almost everything about why it belongs on this list. Succulents store water directly in their thick, fleshy leaves, which means sedum can coast through dry spells that would leave other perennials wilting within a day. Varieties like the classic Autumn Joy typically reach around 18 inches tall and are hardy from about zone 3 through 9, making it one of the most cold-tolerant plants on today's list, despite its desert-adjacent reputation. Sedum comes in 2 basic forms. Low, creeping types work beautifully as ground cover or spilling over rock walls, while upright clumping types like Autumn Joy form dense mounds topped with flat flower clusters that shift color as the season progresses, often starting pale pink or green and deepening into a rich rust or bronze by fall. Because it stores its own moisture, sedum genuinely struggles more with too much water than too little. Well-drained, even poor soil is exactly what it wants. Overwater it or plant it somewhere that stays damp and you'll actually rot the roots faster than drought would ever kill it. For gardeners in hot, dry climates who've struggled to keep anything alive, sedum is often the plant that finally works. Sedum also happens to be one of the easiest perennials to propagate for free. Break off a healthy stem, let the cut end callus over for a day or two, and press it into soil. More often than not, it roots on its own without any rooting hormone or special equipment. That makes it a genuinely inexpensive way to fill out a large dry garden bed, since one mature plant can turn into a dozen new ones over a couple of seasons. Our next flower has been a garden staple for generations, and it's earned that reputation the hard way by simply refusing to die. Number 6. Yarrow. Yarrow, or Achillea, grows in a mounding habit, typically reaching 2 to 3 feet tall and spreading about as wide, with flat-topped clusters of tiny flowers in shades of yellow, white, pink, and red sitting above finely textured, almost fern-like foliage. It prefers full sun, tolerates poor fertility without complaint, and once it's established, it's genuinely one of the most drought-tolerant perennials you can put in the ground. What sets yarrow apart is just how little it asks for. It handles rocky, sandy soil that would frustrate most other flowering plants, and it's a favorite in xeriscaping, specifically because it keeps blooming through stretches of dry weather that shut down less resilient plants. The airy texture also makes it a natural companion for sedum, Russian sage, or ornamental grasses in a dry border. Since the delicate flower clusters create contrast against bolder shapes, pollinators love yarrow just as much as gardeners do, and the cut flowers dry beautifully if you want to bring some of that low watercolor indoors. If you're building a new bed and want one plant that's nearly impossible to kill through neglect or heat, yarrow is usually near the top of every experienced gardener's list. One word of caution that most gardening guides mention only in passing: yarrow spreads by rhizomes underground in addition to reseeding, and in rich, well-watered soil it can spread more aggressively than gardeners expect. In a genuinely dry, lean bed, that spread stays much more manageable, which is honestly one more reason to plant it in the toughest, driest corner of your yard, rather than your most pampered flower bed. Next, we're covering a flower that basically defines the word cheerful, and it might be the single easiest perennial on this entire list to grow from seed. Number 5. Black-Eyed Susan. Black-Eyed Susan, or Rudbeckia, is probably the most recognizable flower on this entire list, with its golden yellow petals wrapped around a dark, almost black center. It's hardy across an enormous range, generally zones 3 through 9, typically growing 2 to 3 feet tall, and it produces that classic daisy-like bloom from around midsummer all the way through fall, filling exactly the gap in the garden calendar when a lot of spring flowers have already finished. Newly planted black-eyed Susans need consistent moisture during that first growing season, roughly an inch of water a week between rainfall and supplemental watering. But once established, usually after a single full season in the ground, Rudbeckia becomes genuinely drought-tolerant, shrugging off extended dry spells with only a modest dip in flower production during the worst of it. It tolerates rocky, sandy, and poor soil with ease, handles occasional road salt without issue, and stays remarkably resistant to deer and disease, as long as it gets decent airflow to avoid powdery mildew in humid climates. Black-Eyed Susan also reseeds enthusiastically, so don't be surprised if you end up with more plants than you originally bought within a couple of seasons. For most gardeners, that's a feature, not a problem. There's an added bonus here for anyone gardening with wildlife in mind. Once the flowers finish blooming in fall, leave the seed heads standing instead of cutting the plant back right away. Finches and other seed-eating birds will visit through winter, turning what looks like a spent flower bed into an active feeding station right outside your window. Our next plant has a reputation as nearly indestructible, and the plant breeding world has spent decades proving that reputation right. Number 4. Daylily. Daylily, or Hemerocallis, might be the most forgiving perennial ever bred, and with over 80,000 registered cultivars, there's essentially a daylily variety for every color palette and garden style imaginable. It's hardy across a wide range, generally zones 3 through 9 and sometimes beyond, typically reaching 1 to 3 feet tall in an arching, fountain-like clump. The name comes from the fact that each individual flower only lasts a single day, but don't let that fool you into thinking the show is short. A mature daylily clump produces so many buds in succession that the overall bloom period can stretch for weeks, sometimes longer, with repeat blooming varieties. Daylilies genuinely benefit from regular watering during active growth, especially in extreme heat, but they're rated as drought and heat resistant once established, tolerating urban conditions, road salt and neglect better than almost anything else you could plant. They adapt to nearly any soil type, from clay to sand, and pests and diseases rarely bother them at all. If you want color, low maintenance, and a plant that essentially takes care of itself after the first year, daylily consistently earns its reputation as the closest thing to a foolproof perennial. Daylilies are also one of the few plants on this list that genuinely improve with age instead of just holding steady. A clump left undisturbed for several years will keep producing more flower stalks each season, and when it eventually gets crowded, dividing it is as simple as digging up the clump and pulling it apart by hand. Each division becomes a brand new plant, which is why daylilies are one of the most commonly shared perennials between neighbors and gardening clubs. Now we're getting into the final stretch of this list, and our next plant brings something none of the others have, a soft, silvery haze that moves in the wind. Number 3. Russian sage. Russian sage, botanically Perovskia, is one of the toughest drought-tolerant perennials you can grow. Prized for its fine, silvery gray foliage and tall spikes of violet-purple flowers that seem to float above the plant in a haze. It's generally hardy from zone 5 through 9, and depending on the variety, it can reach anywhere from 2 to 6 feet tall, making taller cultivars an excellent choice for the back of a sunny border. Not only is Russian sage heat and drought resistant, it's also one of the plants deer and rabbits reliably avoid, along with most other garden pests, thanks to its aromatic foliage. It isn't considered invasive in most regions, but it does spread through both self-seeding and rhizomatous roots, so it can show up in unexpected corners of the garden if left unchecked. Most gardeners consider that a minor annoyance rather than a real problem, since unwanted seedlings are easy to dig up and relocate or simply pull. Full sun and well-drained soil are the only real requirements here. Give Russian sage those two things, and it becomes one of the lowest maintenance plants in the entire garden, blooming from midsummer into fall and pairing beautifully with yarrow, coneflower, or ornamental grasses in a classic dry meadow-style planting. One maintenance tip that trips up a lot of new gardeners. Russian sage should be cut back hard in early spring down to just a few inches above the ground, rather than left standing or trimmed lightly. It blooms on new growth each year, so a hard spring cutback actually produces a fuller, more floriferous plant by summer instead of a leggy, woody one. We're down to the final two now, and both of them are about as iconic as drought-tolerant gardening gets. Number 2. Lavender. Lavandula brings something the rest of this list doesn't quite offer: fragrance. Beyond the silvery foliage and the spikes of purple, blue, or white flowers, brushing past a lavender plant releases that unmistakable scent that's made it a garden favorite for centuries. English lavender, the most common type for colder climates, is generally hardy from around zone 5 through 9, typically growing 1 to 3 feet tall depending on the variety. Full sun and excellent drainage are non-negotiable for lavender. It genuinely struggles in heavy clay or anywhere water tends to pool, and it's far more likely to die from overwatering or poor drainage than from drought. In fact, many experienced growers recommend planting lavender in slightly raised beds or working sand and gravel into the soil specifically to keep its roots dry, since that's the environment it evolved in across the Mediterranean. Once it's settled into the right spot, lavender becomes remarkably self-sufficient, needing only occasional watering during the driest stretches of summer. Bees adore it, deer generally avoid it, and the dried flowers hold their fragrance for months if you cut and hang them. For gardeners who want a drought-tolerant plant that also smells incredible, lavender is usually the first one people reach for. If you're in a colder climate and worried about winter survival, look specifically for English lavender varieties bred for cold hardiness, since some of the more fragrant French and Spanish types simply can't handle winters much below zone 8. A light trim in early spring, cutting back to just above the woody growth, keeps lavender compact and productive for years, instead of letting it get leggy and sparse in the center, which is the most common way gardeners accidentally kill an otherwise healthy plant. And that brings us to number 1, the single most dependable, most widely recommended drought-tolerant perennial on nearly every list like this one. Number 1. Coneflower. Coneflower or echinacea might be the single most dependable drought-tolerant bloomer for gardens across the United States, and it earns that top spot for good reason. It's native to the eastern and central regions of the country, hardy across an impressively wide range, generally zones 3 through 9, and depending on the cultivar it can reach anywhere from about 1 foot up to 4 feet tall, with that unmistakable daisy-like flower surrounding a spiky, cone-shaped center that gives the plant its name. Coneflower prefers full sun and well-drained soil, and while it grows best with moderate water, it becomes genuinely drought and heat tolerant once established, usually within 2 to 3 years. During that first year after planting, though, regular watering really does matter. Since a young coneflower hasn't yet built the deep root system that lets mature plants shrug off extended dry spells. Bees, butterflies, and even birds treat coneflower as a favorite. Pollinators can't get enough of the nectar, and if you leave the spent flower heads standing through fall and winter instead of cutting them back, goldfinches and other birds will happily feed on the seeds. Coneflower is also deer-resistant, largely pest and disease-free, and it reseeds itself readily if you let a few blooms go to seed, meaning a single planting can slowly fill in a bed over the following years without you doing much of anything. It's low maintenance, long blooming from summer, often right through the first frost, and genuinely difficult to kill once it's settled in. Divide mature clumps every 3 to 4 years if they start looking crowded, and you'll keep the planting vigorous for well over a decade. If you only plant one drought-tolerant perennial from this entire list, coneflower is the one nearly every expert agrees you should start with. That's the full list. 12 perennials that handle heat, dry spells, and less than perfect soil once they're established, proving that a genuinely beautiful garden doesn't have to mean a garden hose running every single evening. A quick recap on care, since it applies across nearly every plant we covered today. Water consistently during that first growing season while roots are establishing. After that, most of these perennials actually prefer being left alone, since overwatering causes more problems than drought ever will. Full sun and well-drained soil are the two things almost every plant on this list has in common, so if you're designing a new bed, start there, and the rest tends to fall into place. If your yard has heavy clay soil, don't panic. Nearly every plant we covered can still work. You'll just want to amend the planting area with compost, coarse sand, or even build a slightly raised bed to improve drainage before you put anything in the ground. It's a bit more upfront effort, but it's the difference between a thriving low-water garden and a frustrating one where plants rot at the roots despite doing everything else right. Mix a few of these together: coneflower with black-eyed Susan, sedum with yarrow, Russian sage with lavender, and you'll have a border that stays colorful from late spring through the first frost while asking almost nothing of you in return. And once these plants are truly established, most gardeners find they can go 2 or 3 weeks without rain in the height of summer and barely notice a difference in how the bed looks. If you want a full planting guide with spacing and companion pairings for a complete drought-tolerant border, that video is coming soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it.